Hello and welcome. The main objective of these videos is to introduce you to the activities that I believe are key to working with FHIR. You're getting a lot of theory in the reading material for the unit, and you've got all the information available on the FHIR website, so the idea here is to give you some guidance on what I think is important as far as doing activities. One of the main activities that you're always going to have to do is generate resources. And working with resources is one of the fundamentals of FHIR. So the idea here is to give you a close-up look at what a FHIR resource is. When you have to create it in production, you'll probably use some programming language to generate it, but for educational purposes, I think it'll be good to go over a resource in detail. So whenever you want or need to create a resource in FHIR, you should go to the resource definition page. On the HL7 International site, under the FHIR option hl7.org/FHIR, at the beginning you'll see the entire list of resources with the different elements you want, in alphabetical order, by level of maturity, by category, and so on. You'll see the list of resources. You'll see the ones marked with N, which are the normative resources, and it will show the level of maturity next to each one. Since the goal of our first activity is to generate a patient resource, in this video I'm going to focus on showing you how to work with a resource, in this case a patient resource. I'll open up Patient, and I see all the elements that I have available for each one of the resources. A list of examples of different patients in different formats, XML, JSON, that you can use as a starting point. When you're creating a patient resource and working with patients, it is essential to have really detailed examples, detailed descriptions of each of the elements and what they're used for, the mapping, and the different elements. Okay, so at the beginning, there's an introduction to the resource. It goes over what the other resources are that work with the patient resource. Obviously, the patient is central to the health information system, and I can see the content for each resource. Then I take a look at each one of the elements, and I can see what their cardinality is and the data type for each one. Then I can see the possible identifiers I can have, from none to several, and the data type from the type of identifier. And from right here, I can access the structure that the identifier has. I can see this same structure in the form of a tree. I can see it in UML format, in XML format, and in JSON format. Within each of the elements and each resource, I am always going to have the part with the definition of the structure, what terminology is constrained, what the constraints are, and more elements that are specific to each of the resources. In this case, it says how to work with patient identifiers, how to link patients, but that is specified for each of the resources. At the end of the page, at the end of each of the resources, I will always see the search parameters that I'll use in the following units, as I keep on looking at the basics of generating resources. So anybody who already has a good technical grounding in either XML or JSON can use either of these templates to generate them. Also, if you want to validate the resource within the documentation part of FHIR, in the download section I can download all the schemas to validate the resources. I can download all the schemas, but right now I'm not going to download them because I already have them. For those who need a little more help in terms of how to generate a patient resource, you can start with the examples and edit them for this first resource that you have to generate. Or you can work with a page called clinfhir.com. Clinfhir.com is a site created by David Hay, who is one of the creators of FHIR, where he takes a little less technical and more clinical approach. He's a clinician himself, and so he gives a brief overview of the different elements that the different resources can have. There are various tools, but right now I'm going to focus on the patient viewer, which I use to generate patients. So I can look for an existing patient or I can generate a new one, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to generate a new resource and I'll try to use some elements. I can do a search for it, or if I want to create it, like I do now, I have the option at the bottom of searching for a resource that I've created using FHIR, or I can add a new one. In this case, I'm going to add a new patient. To add the resource now, it's going to ask me to complete these elements. First of all, the identifier. Note that the activity asks you for certain constraints that could be their user ID or some of the elements that I'll ask you to edit. So my advice is to look at what the activity asks you to do and go ahead and complete it, because it will generate a sample patient that I can then use to send the activity to the campus so it can grade the activity for us. So in identifier, let's put, say, my email address for first name, Fernando, and I'll also put in last name. And for date of birth, I'll put, okay, I'm really young. I'm just 19 years old. So I'm going to leave the gender male, and I'm going to ask it to generate some samples for me. I'm going to see that this will really help me understand how the relationship between the different resources works. I mean, I'm creating a patient resource that's pretty basic, but I'll see how it works combined with other resources and how they relate to each other in FHIR. So I click on Add New Patient, and I see that it added the patient Fernando Campos, assigned him this ID, and also added conditions, encounters, observations, medication list, appointments, a list of allergies. Now let's close the page, and then I'll see all the types of resources that our activity generated. So in the patient resource, it says Fernando Campos. It's going to take a second here to come up, but there it is. And it has the data of the resource that I just generated. I have the structure in tree format or in JSON format or XML format. And what I was telling you about seeing how it works is that in general, an appointment is related to a patient or a condition is related to a patient. So I see a list of conditions. Say the patient has diabetes, and that's how the condition of diabetes is indicated. Okay, I'm going to have a condition resource. Let's say the state is going to be active. And the same goes for all the different resources that I'm looking at. For example, egg allergy. I have all the detail of the coding of the egg allergy that refers to the patient. Okay, now, to continue doing the activity, which asks me to generate a patient resource that has a lot more constraints or more elements, it's also asking me to add an address or a means of contact. So what I'm going to do is go into the patient and copy the XML so I can work on it in the same XML editor that I usually use. I'll copy the resource and I'll go on over to the XML editor. I open up our XML editor. In this case, I'm going to work with XML. Some people prefer to work with JSON, but since what I want to do is work with the schema that I have already downloaded, the idea is to show you and use the elements that I would need to add to generate the resource that the activity asks me for. In this case, I'll create a new XML file and paste the patient that I generated with FHIR. So I see that I have the patient resource with the data that I picked up from the version. The first thing I'm going to do is associate the schema to validate the resource. This tool has, well, it depends on the editor, but in this case, the menu gives me an option to associate the schema, And what I do is search within all the schemas that I've downloaded for the patient schema. I associate the patient schema, and what I can do now is validate the resource. Look down here at the bottom, and you'll see that the resource tells me if it is valid or not, and if it isn't, it will show me the line that is incorrect. The advantage of working with this editor and having the associated schema is that as I'm going along generating elements or building elements, it's going to be helping me with the elements I need to create. Look at how when I just put in the less than sign to start a tag, it shows me what options I still have available to generate the patient. Name doesn't come up anymore because name is already there. I already included it. But what I can do is put in an address. So I'll select the address. Since the type of address contains several elements within it, I can see that I can put in a street, and here I see what the element is. In the street, I have an ID and a value, so I put in the name of the street and whatever else, maybe the city, and in the value, I'll include the name of the city. So just like I did with this element, I'm going to keep on going and generate the different elements or items that the activity asks me to. Now, if for some reason I have something that doesn't agree with the schema, with what FHIR wants the patient resource to have, the editor is automatically going to mark it. And if I take out some of these lines, for example, look at how it flags it right away. Down here, too, it flags the content that is invalid. And once I have the document all completed with all the items that the activity asks for, I'm now going to copy the complete document and send it to the campus to be graded.